这样子的，是否感兴趣大家？
Doris Larius from the United States, and I was wondering if there is any correlation between the places where the fungus, amphibian frogs and fungus are found with sites with pollution or agricultural uses. So are there any pictures emerging of what also might be linked to where the amphibians are sensitive to this, or is this being studied?
I'll just take that step. It's mostly about the trade. It seems to be characterized in humans moving species of frogs around that are already infected. That's the majority. There are synergies when frogs are more likely to become infected, and then when the infection is more likely to be deadly. That's really the major movement here. The major reason it seems to start around for humans moving individual frogs around.
It's a very, very good question. And when people, Hickory fungus was just really first discovered in 1998, 1999, it hasn't been a long time. And the patterns, even on first discovery, did make sense in some ways. For instance, in the eastern parts of North America, the northeast of the US, Canada, Hickory fungus is very common, and yet there are no signs of decline. Some of these areas, like where I used to work in Boston, are extremely polluted. Frogs have Hickory fungus and they do not decline. And yet you go to pristine areas like the western parts of the US, the Rocky Mountains, or not very rainforests. And these are not polluted. These are clean and green as you can get. And there, the fungus is devastating. In some cases, we think it's due, as they said, to the spread of fungus through introduced frogs, such as bullfrogs. In other areas, like in Central America or in Queensland and Australia, we don't have a clue how to contact. But those, again, are clean green areas, so there's no obvious correlation at all.
I'm Iwan Jang of Ewha University in Korea, and my question was to Dr. Ray Brown. It's very impressive work. Once, if your approach is implemented in that factor, it could be quite revolutionary to identify species and to assess the diversity in general. I'm personally involved in some research on tree frogs and crickets, and especially in crickets. There's several group of species very closely related, and two of them are, I would say, it's morphologically indistinguishable. You can't really tell one species from the other. And so I tried to use some integrated approaches, like the morphological, behavior, and genetics analysis. But it is the behavior, what I'm saying is the call data, the cluster data, that's the, I would say, reliable character that can isolate the species. And as you saw in the portion of data, in your data, where you try to isolate, you did a very similar work on the behavior, morphology, and the genetics. And it seems to me that the call data is correspond to the new species group. Is that the, I just want to ask you, is that right, or is it do you need? Right?
Sure, yeah, in amphibians, just like many organisms that breed and interact at night, the acoustic modality is the way they communicate. Their entire sort of primary species recognition criterion is the sound that they produce in their reproductive effort. That's true for a lot of insects, that's true for lots of other groups of organisms. But to do this kind of thing on a large scale, one just needs to identify characters that are the modality of the communication signal that the organisms use, and in many other organisms, like birds, is color or some other characteristic. And so it's just a matter of sort of paying attention to biology, the natural history of the organism, And I'm of strong opinion, we've been using these three characters, just morphology and genetics, DNA sequences, and acoustic characters, but I'm of strong opinion that no one character is better than any other character. If you're going to do this on a large scale, you just sort of need to figure out what are the key characters that are going to be informative to take a shotgun approach, sort of like barcoding for behavior or barcoding for any other ecological character or whatever. And if you know your organisms, that's usually pretty obvious to people who work with the species. Thanks.
I have one more point. Basically, if you are considering morphologies as considered to be a plasticity, the same plasticity you can see in the biodiversity too. Especially in the case of the time of recording, that's very important, especially in the case of tree frogs. While you record the things that relate to the late evening and the early evening, you can see the difference of the spectrum is entirely different. So the plasticity is both in morphology, molecules, and biodiversities.
So I'm going to just take advantage here that I'm sort of moderating, and I'm going to, we have just 15 minutes left before we have the session, and just trying to make a linkage to the Amphibian Conservation Action Plan, the activation of the Amphibian, or energizing the Amphibian Conservation Action Plan. Just to take advantage that I have a wonderful panel of experts here, I'm just going to ask them what they see as the key elements that have to be added to the mix so that we can actually go from knowing a lot about amphibians and improving our knowledge to actually informing decision and therefore being able to start acting towards conservation from their different perspectives. Remember that we have here a very diverse panel. So.
Okay, thanks. Well, I already exposed my bias towards the continued study of systematics of group. That sounds like research, but I feel like it's an action in and of itself. Because we're not testing a hypothesis, we're trying to find what's there and make sure that we're informed about what biodiversity is. But in general, I think the coordinated network of the Amphibian Species Alliance and Action Plan is the key to building those networks, that umbrella, enhancing communication and popularizing amphibian conservation. And you can think about lots of very successful conservation programs around the world that were as simple as a simple slogan or a simple group of a coordinating body that got people in touch with each other. So for me, I think of network building and communication as the key element.
Yeah, exactly the same feeling for me too. Basically, the conservation is always considered conservation, especially in the case of drought disease. But systematics is fundamental things for at least to understand the distribution pattern of the particular species, whether it is known or unknown. That's also a key factor. It's actually, we're always talking about conservation all the time, but no data, there is no conservation. Data is coming from expedition, data is coming from identification of species, and disclaiming species is not a very important thing at the same time. It's also a big part of conservation that has to be done.
네, 저는 조금 다른 정책적인 측면을 말씀드리겠습니다. 양면을 보존하기 위해서 물론 새로운 쪽을 찾고 구조에 대해서 알고자 하는 노력이 중요하지만 제가 본 관점에서는 서식지에 대한 보존이 더 중요하지 않을까라고 생각합니다. 이에 대해서 저희 같은 경우는 어떤 특정들에 대해서, 그러니까 그런 새로운 점이 아니고 이미 기존에 알고 있는 중에서 그 종에 대한 서식 현황 특징이라든지 이런 것들을 연구를 해서 그런 서식지 특성의 특징에 맞는 다른 예측 가능한 서식지를 보존을 해주는 것이 그 연결을 보존하는 데 있어서 그것이 중요한 것 중에 하나이지 않을까 생각합니다.
Excellent. I think I'm just going to reiterate what a couple of people already said. It's really about getting all the stakeholders to communicate, and we have to figure out who wants what. I know that managers of protected areas have their agenda. I know researchers want to inculcate the next generation of scientists. I know that governments want to take care of their constituencies. It's getting all these goals on the same table at the same time. The late, great Lynn Ostrom, the first woman the won the Nobel Prize for Economics. I think her prime directive that brought her to great notoriety is the fact that you have to get all the stakeholders to the table. A meeting like the IUCN is critically important, and communicate. I think there's a lot of talk, but there might not be a lot of communication. And I think that's critical. All be at the same table and get those messages across.
So I'm not an expert here. I'm just a representative of the private sector, but I've heard about fundraising. I've heard about need for participation of everyone. I think that what could help to go from knowledge from the action to the enhancement of the conservation is really to have people understand the role of amphibians within the world we're living in. Because if I'm going back to the example I just presented, at the beginning, the people on the site were not just, they didn't know about biodiversity and they didn't know the importance of this. First, we did this survey and this highlighted that there were some species there. Some of these species were protected. So that's the law, okay? We have to protect the species because there is a law. But when there is no law, okay, we have some species, but why we should do something? And here comes the importance of this ecosystem services approach, because through this, we can show people what is the role, what these species are here for. And then when people are conscious of the role of the species, then they have a good reason to protect it. So this ecosystem services approach doesn't fit all the problems, because the power of it and at the same time the weakness of it is that it needs to be some use. It's a man's anthropo. If there is no use, there is no value of it. But then when there is no value, the law is there to protect it. So I guess that maybe if we can better show people what is the use of all these fabulous amphibian species in the world we're living in, then people will stop doing things that they don't know it's bad for these amphibians.
The problem we all face, interested in conservation, is that we're human beings and we get selected to be selfish. And we are very short-sighted, and we have pressing demands on us for ourselves and our families. Whether you're in a developing society or in a first world society, we have very short views. People are the problem. And to quote one of the candidates for president in the United States, companies, corporations are people too. At every level, there's selfishness. This is really the crux of the matter, but it's not just that, it's lack of education. So, what we need to do is educate people on how important, at every level, from the ground up, from the grassroots level up to the top, and from the top down to the bottom, how important conservation is. It doesn't just affect amphibians. People often say that amphibians are a sensitive bioindicator. Well, they are, but there are lots of other taxa that are sensitive bioindicators as well. These problems face us all. Unless we have a very, very short-term perspective, there's no way we're going to solve this problem. It's going to require a major change in the way people and every other constituency of IUCN, which is everything on this planet, thinks. Now, that sounds like a tough job, but if we look at climate change, David talked about, if we go back just a few years, there are a lot of doubters about climate change. People now accept climate change. They may still argue about whether it's due to human effects or whether it's due to anthropogenic effects. But the climate is changing. It's changing so fast that no matter what we do, species are not going to be able to survive, all of them. They're not going to be able to evolve. Even in a perfect natural world, they're not going to be able to evolve fast enough to adapt to these changes. Some will survive. So what I advocate, and when Heine and I, principally along with our collaborators, were proposing this workshop, I sort of took the devil's advocate point of view that we have to start from the grassroots of the lot, the ground up approach. These are ecological, ecosystem approaches. Ground up or top down. We need to do both. And I think in the presentation today, you've heard both. And I tried to highlight, especially since I did not actively participate, some of the NGOs who are genuinely concerned. And everything I've heard, most people are very exhausted, but they're people, and it's not their fault. I'm not making a value call here. People have lots of pressing demands. But there are lots of people who also care very deeply. And they show deep passion and commitment to saving particular species or particular localities, and we see that clearly in Korea as we have everywhere else at our work, which is many places. But they're intimidated by the experts, and they don't really want to communicate with us. And then we have miscommunication between government and scientists and mistrust. So it requires education, it requires networking, it requires developing trust, and it requires some optimism that together we can come to a solution, and we have to come to a solution. We have no choice to come to a solution, or we're not going to be around very long.
Okay, so we have just 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to take advantage to make some concluding remarks here. As the representative of the coordinating body of the, as I mentioned during my presentation, the whole idea is that we need to integrate all the different aspects that are required for conservation under one single umbrella. I think the panel in a way illustrates this. So we cannot be experts on everything. So we heard from Dr. Brown that we still need the discoveries, we need to do the exploration. We don't really know what we have. So it's important to keep trying to identify what's there out to save before we lose it. We also heard from Dr. Viju all the different aspects, all the different threats that are a problem for amphibians. But it's not enough just to identify what are the threats. So, because if we just know the threats but we don't do anything about them, then all we have is a perfect record of what's happening, but we're not really answering that. Actually, we heard from the policy that there's a number of tools that are in place here in Korea, for example. All these different policies, all these different platforms. There's some laws, there's protected areas, regulations, there's protection of endangered species, and all these different things we have to start attaching all the knowledge to those things in order to be able to. We also heard that there's no single initiative, no single regulation or law on amphibians, and this is probably because we haven't managed to feed all this extensive knowledge that was illustrated here to the level of the policy. So we need to improve those communication channels. We also heard about climate change and how sometimes we tend to oversimplify the problem. And again, that's probably another issue that it's not necessarily well understood by the non-experts. So all those things we need to learn to filter, and that's just through dialogue and through working together. We heard that the private sector that many of us might have thought that can play a role is actually a very influential sector. After all, in the current economy, in the current world, the private sector is one of the very strong stakeholders in everything that happens. So it's not just the governments, it's not just the Russian movements, it's all the three that have to be involved. So we need to engage with them. Sometimes they have actually very interesting solutions and actually a very active interest in promoting conservation. In the case of the Algae water, it's actually part of their system because it's having, they can actually demonstrate that the entire business model is working, and it would be catastrophic for them if where they're working there were going to be lots of extinctions and things like that, so that wouldn't work. So I think overall this is an example of what we're trying to do. We're trying to work together. We're trying to mainstream amphibian conservation
turn amphibian conservation from just recording, from just conversations among the experts to something that everybody can talk about, and everybody can identify different conservation problems, broader conservation problems with the amphibians. The way that now everybody understands that if we save elephants, in order to save elephants, we have to do many things and not just count elephants. Or if we want to save birds, there's lots of interactions. And people understand those things, and we have to learn to do that for amphibians, and the way to do that is to work together. So, before I finish, just if anybody has additional questions, we'll just run out of time. But if anybody has additional questions or wants to get additional information about the amphibian survival lines, or any additional questions to the panel members, then just feel free to meet with us just outside here. Thank you very much for attending.
이런 거 물병을 일단 이쪽에 놔두고 종이 같은 거 그냥 한 이상
All those presentations, can I get them?